Mid-Tuesday morning in September 2019, tucked inside a water-stained cardboard box, along with dozens of other items donated by the estate of Mrs. Dorothy Williams, who had passed away at 97. The box sat unopened for 3 weeks in the archives, until graduate intern Marcus Thompson began the routine task of cataloging its contents. Marcus pulled out the photograph carefully, its edges brown and curled with age. The image showed 3 black women posed in a formal studio setting. A mother seated in an ornate chair, flanked by her 2 daughters standing on either side. All 3 wore their finest dresses, dark and modest, typical of the late 19th century. The photographer's mark on the bottom read, J. Pemberton Studio, Atlanta, Georgia, 1899. At first glance, it seemed like countless other family portraits from that era. Marcus noted the serious expressions, common when subjects had to remain perfectly still for long exposures. He documented the image in the database, assigned it a catalog number, and prepared to move on to the next item. But something stopped him. Marcus had spent 2 years studying African American history, particularly the post-Civil War period in the South. As he held the photograph under the archival lamp, a detail caught his attention that made his breath catch. The hands. All 3 women had positioned their hands in an unusual way, not relaxed at their sides or folded demurely, but held deliberately at specific angles, fingers forming precise configurations. The mother's right hand rested on the arm of the chair with her thumb, index, and middle fingers extended, while her ring and pinky fingers touched her palm. The daughter, on the left, held both hands at waist level, palms facing each other but not touching, fingers spread in a measured pattern. The daughter on the right had one hand near her collar, fingers arranged in what seemed like an intentional gesture. Marcus photographed the image with his phone and enlarged it on his screen. The positioning was too deliberate to be accidental. These weren't random poses chosen for aesthetic reasons. There was intention here, purpose. He felt a surge of excitement mixed with uncertainty. After 4 hours of comparing the hand positions to various historical references, Marcus picked up his phone and called Dr. Patricia Hayes, the center's chief historian. Dr. Hayes, he said, his voice trembling slightly, I think I found something important. Dr. Patricia Hayes arrived at the archives within 20 minutes of Marcus's call, her reading glasses dangling from a chain around her neck and a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. At 62, she had spent 4 decades studying African American history in the South, publishing extensively on resistance movements and coded communication systems used by enslaved and newly freed people. Marcus had the photograph displayed on the light table when she entered. A high-resolution scan pulled up on the adjacent computer monitor. He stepped back as Dr. Hayes approached, watching her face carefully for any reaction. She leaned over the photograph, silent for nearly a minute, her eyes moving systematically across every detail. Then she saw the hands. Her expression shifted from professional curiosity to intense focus. She pulled her glasses up and examined the image more closely, then moved to the computer screen to zoom in on each woman's hand position. Where did you say this came from? She asked quietly, not taking her eyes from the screen. Estate donation. Dorothy Williams. She was 97 when she passed. The photograph was in a box of family items, nothing else remarkable. Marcus pulled up the donation records on his tablet. According to the paperwork, Mrs. Williams was the great-granddaughter of one of the women in this photo, though we don't know which one yet. Dr. Hayes enlarged the image of the mother's hand, studying the precise arrangement of her fingers. She then pulled out her phone and scrolled through her photo library, comparing the hand position to something Marcus couldn't see. Marcus, do you know what the Underground Railroad was? Dr. Hayes asked. Of course, the network that helped enslaved people escape to freedom before the Civil War. Before and after, Dr. Hayes corrected, her voice gaining intensity. Most people think the Underground Railroad ended in 1865 with the Emancipation Proclamation and the 13th Amendment, but the violence didn't stop. Lynchings, forced labor contracts, black codes, the South found new ways to enslave people legally. Some networks continued operating in secret, helping families escape to safer territories. She turned the monitor toward Marcus, showing him a scanned page from a historical document. It showed crude drawings of hand signals with annotations in faded ink. These are conductor signals, Dr. Hayes continued, ways that Underground Railroad operators identified themselves to each other and communicated information. Most of these signals were never photographed. They were passed down through oral tradition and demonstration only. Until now, we only had written descriptions and sketches. Marcus looked from the document to the photograph, comparing the hand positions. His pulse quickened. Are you saying... I'm saying these 3 women are displaying Underground Railroad conductor signals in a formal photograph taken 34 years after slavery officially ended. Dr. Hayes' hands trembled slightly as she reached for the photograph. This shouldn't exist. It's either an incredible historical discovery or an elaborate coincidence, and I don't believe in coincidences when it comes to our ancestors. She pulled out her phone again. I need to make some calls. We need a specialist, someone who has studied these signals extensively. And we need to find out everything we can about Dorothy Williams and her family. Marcus felt a mixture of pride and nervous energy coursing through him. What do we do first? Dr. Hayes looked at him with a slight smile. First, we verify, then we investigate. If I'm right about what I'm seeing, this photograph is going to rewrite what we know about resistance in the post-Civil War South. But we need to be absolutely certain before we make any claims. Dr. Hayes reached out to Dr. Leonard Washington, a historian at Howard University who had spent 15 years researching coded communication systems used by formerly enslaved people. He arrived in Atlanta 2 days later, carrying a worn leather briefcase filled with documents, journals, and photocopies of testimonies collected from descendants of Underground Railroad participants. The three of them gathered in the archive's research room, the photograph displayed on a large monitor. Dr. Washington, a tall man in his 50s with graying temples and intense eyes, studied the image in complete silence for several minutes before speaking. The mother's signal, he finally said, pointing to her right hand. Thumb, index, and middle finger extended, ring and pinky folded. That's called the safe house marker. It was used to indicate a location where people could find shelter. The specific finger configuration told you how many days you could stay safely. He zoomed in on the daughter standing to the left. Her hands, palms facing each other, the distance between them, fingers spread just so, that's a distance measurement. The space between her palms represents approximately 20 miles. It was a way to communicate how far the next safe point was without speaking. Marcus leaned forward, fascinated. And the other daughter? Dr. Washington moved the image to show the right daughter's hand near her collar. That's the most significant one. Hand near the throat, fingers in that exact position. It's a warning signal. It means danger or watch closely. But look at which finger she's holding up. 2 fingers. That specified the type of danger, in this case, law enforcement or bounty hunters. Dr. Hayes pulled out a notebook and began writing rapidly. So if we're interpreting this correctly, these 3 women are communicating. Safe house available. Next point is 20 miles away. Beware of law enforcement. They encoded an entire message into a family portrait. More than that, Dr. Washington added, pulling out a photocopy from his briefcase. Look at the photographer's name. J. Pemberton. I've seen that name in testimonies. Several formerly enslaved people mentioned a photographer in Atlanta who was sympathetic to their cause, who would take portraits, and sometimes add people to images who weren't actually there during the exposure, creating documentation for people who needed new identities. Marcus felt goosebumps rise on his arms. You're saying this photographer was part of the network? Possibly. If he was, these women weren't just posing for a family portrait. They were creating a document, a map of sorts, that could be shared with other members of the network. The photograph could be reproduced, distributed, carrying information without words. Dr. Hayes stood and walked to the window, her mind clearly racing. But why 1899? Why so long after the official end of slavery? What were they protecting people from? Dr. Washington's expression grew somber. 1899 was one of the worst years for racial violence in Georgia's history. Lynchings were at their peak. The convict lease system was in full operation. Black men arrested on false charges and forced into labor camps that were, in many ways, worse than slavery had been. And there were areas where entire black communities were being driven out through violence and intimidation. He pulled out more documents, spreading them across the table. The Underground Railroad didn't end, it evolved. Instead of guiding people to the north, it was helping families relocate to safer black communities, hiding people fleeing false accusations, moving children away from areas where they'd be forced into exploitative labor contracts. These women weren't just making a symbolic gesture. They were active participants in an ongoing resistance movement. Marcus looked at the photograph with new eyes, seeing not just 3 women in their Sunday best, but 3 operatives in a dangerous, clandestine network, brave enough to document their work, even knowing the risks if the wrong people understood the image. The next step was identifying the 3 women in the photograph. Dr. Hayes contacted Dorothy Williams' surviving family members, starting with her grandson, James Williams, who lived in Savannah. He was initially skeptical when she explained the reason for her call, but agreed to meet them at the History Center the following week. James arrived on a Saturday morning, a man in his early 60s with kind eyes and his great-grandmother's high cheekbones. He carried a small wooden box, worn smooth by generations of handling. My grandmother never talked much about her family's history, James explained as they gathered around the photograph. She said some stories were meant to be kept quiet. But before she passed, she gave me this box and told me that someday someone would ask the right questions. He opened the box carefully. Inside were 3 items: a small leather journal with pages yellowed and brittle, a silver locket containing a tiny photograph, and a folded piece of cloth with embroidered symbols. Dr. Hayes reached for the journal with gloved hands, opening it delicately. The handwriting inside was elegant but faded, entries dated from 1894 to 1903. The first page bore a name, Clara. Clara was my great-great-grandmother, James said, pointing to the woman seated in the chair in the photograph. The daughters were Ruth and Esther. According to what little my grandmother told me, they were known in their community as healers and midwives, but she always said there was more to their story. Dr. Washington began reading the journal entries, his eyes widening as he moved through the pages. The entries were careful, often cryptic, but patterns emerged. References to visitors in the night, notes about journeys completed safely, lists of supplies purchased, food, blankets, shoes in various sizes, in quantities far beyond what a family of 3 would need. One entry from May 1899 read, 3 souls departed Thursday last, made it to the second house without incident, sent word ahead. E. Concerned about the road ahead, R says her hands remembered the old ways. Marcus photographed each page carefully while Dr. Hayes examined the embroidered cloth. The symbols stitched into the fabric matched some of the hand signals from the photograph, a visual code translated into thread. Your ancestors were incredibly brave, Dr. Hayes told James, her voice thick with emotion. Clara, Ruth, and Esther weren't just surviving in a dangerous time. They were actively saving lives. James wiped his eyes. My grandmother used to say, our hands built this country and our hands know how to protect our people. I never understood what she meant until now. The locket contained a second, smaller photograph, the 3 women again, this time standing outside a modest house with a distinctive brick chimney. Dr. Washington recognized it immediately from his research. I know this house, he said excitedly, or I know of it. There are references in oral histories to a place in the sweet Auburn neighborhood, a house with a red brick chimney where people could find help. It was called the Potter's House, though no one in the testimonies ever explained why. Dr. Hayes made a note. We need to find out if that house still exists. If we can locate it and match it to property records, we can trace more of their activities, possibly find other families they helped. Over the next 2 hours, James shared everything his grandmother had told him. Stories of women in the family who were known for their discretion, who kept unusual hours, who always seemed to have extra food to share. Tales of visitors who arrived late at night and disappeared by morning. Warnings passed down through generations about keeping certain truths private, about understanding when silence was protection. She told me once, James said quietly, that our family's hands carried memory, that if I ever felt lost, I should look at my own hands and remember what they came from. I thought it was just poetic. I didn't realize it was literal. Dr. Hayes and Marcus spent the next 3 days searching through property records, city directories, and old maps of Atlanta's sweet Auburn neighborhood. The area had been the heart of Black Atlanta in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, home to thriving businesses, churches, and community organizations. But urban development, highway construction, and decades of neglect had dramatically altered the landscape. On the 4th day, they found a reference in an 1898 city directory. Mrs. Clara Potter, midwife and herbalist, residence Howell Street. The address matched the location visible in the background of the small locket photograph. Potter wasn't a nickname for the house, Marcus realized. It was her name, Clara Potter. She must have married someone named Potter, or perhaps it was a name she took for protection. They drove to what remained of Howell Street that afternoon. Most of the original structures had been demolished, replaced by modern buildings or empty lots grown wild with vegetation. But at the end of a half-forgotten side street behind a chain-link fence overgrown with kudzu, they found it, a small, deteriorating house with a distinctive red brick chimney, partially collapsed but still recognizable. Dr. Hayes felt tears sting her eyes. It survived. They contacted the city to gain access to the property, a process that took 2 weeks of paperwork and permissions. When they finally entered the house, accompanied by structural engineers to ensure their safety, they found it in advanced decay. The roof had partially collapsed, water damage had destroyed much of the interior, and decades of abandonment had left the place filled with debris. But in what had been the kitchen, beneath a collapsed section of flooring, Marcus discovered something extraordinary. A hidden cellar, its entrance concealed by rotted boards and generations of dirt. The cellar was small, no more than 8 feet square, with brick walls and a dirt floor. But along one wall, carved into the bricks, were symbols, the same symbols that had been embroidered on the cloth in James Williams' wooden box. And on the opposite wall, carved more roughly, were names, dozens of names, some with dates beside them. Dr. Washington, who had joined them for this exploration, photographed each name carefully. These are the people they helped, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. This is a record of everyone who passed through this house seeking safety. Among the names, they found family names that still existed in Atlanta's black community. The Johnsons, the Crawfords, the Washingtons. People whose descendants still lived in the city, unaware that their ancestors had been saved by 3 women whose names had been forgotten by official history. Near the bottom of the list of names, in neater script than the others, they found an inscription. We who were hidden here honor those who hid us. The hands that guided us will never be forgotten. 1899-1903. Dr. Hayes ran her gloved fingers gently over the carved words. The house was more than a shelter. It was a monument, a testimony carved in brick and hidden from those who would have destroyed it. We need to preserve this, she said firmly. Every name, every symbol. This cellar is a historical document as important as any archive. Over the following weeks, they worked with preservation specialists to document every detail of the cellar before the house's complete structural failure made it inaccessible. They cross-referenced the names with census records, church registries, and death certificates, slowly building a picture of the scope of Clara, Ruth, and Esther's network. The names represented people from all over Georgia and neighboring states, men fleeing false accusations, women escaping abusive labor contracts, children whose parents had been imprisoned under the convict lease system, entire families threatened by racial violence. The three women had helped more than 200 people over a 4-year period, all while maintaining their public identities as respectable, unremarkable members of their community. As the research deepened, a broader picture emerged. Clara, Ruth, and Esther weren't working alone. They were part of a sophisticated network that stretched across the South, connecting safe houses, trusted individuals, and sympathetic allies in a web of resistance that had remained hidden for more than a century. Dr. Washington brought in additional researchers from universities across the country, each contributing pieces of the puzzle. A professor from Spelman College found church records showing that Ruth had been a deaconess, giving her access to travelers and visitors without arousing suspicion. A historian from Auburn University discovered that Esther had worked as a seamstress, creating clothing for people who needed to change their appearance before traveling, and Clara's work as a midwife had provided the perfect cover. She traveled freely throughout the county, called to births at all hours of the day and night, carrying a large medical bag that could easily conceal documents, money, or small items needed by those fleeing danger. No one questioned a midwife's comings and goings. The journal provided more clues, as Dr. Washington painstakingly decoded its careful language. Delivered a healthy child often meant successfully moving someone to the next safe point. Complications arose, indicated danger or close calls with authorities. Mother and child recovering well meant someone had reached safety in another city or state. One entry from August 1899 stood out. Difficult delivery last night. Thought we would lose them both. E's quick thinking and R's steady hands made the difference. The family of 5 now rests safely. Had to use the old signal to reach JP for documentation. He came through as always. JP, Marcus said. The photographer. J. Pemberton. He wasn't just taking their picture. He was providing forged documents. Dr. Hayes nodded. Photographs were becoming more common for identification purposes in the 1890s. If Pemberton could create convincing portraits, he could provide people with new identities. A photograph, a name, and suddenly you're someone else, someone without a criminal record or a warrant. They found more evidence of Pemberton's involvement in city records. His studio had burned down in 1904 under suspicious circumstances, and he'd left Atlanta shortly after. Some oral histories mentioned a photographer who'd helped people but had to flee when authorities became suspicious. The photograph of Clara, Ruth, and Esther took on new meaning. It wasn't just a coded message, it was proof of their connection to Pemberton, documentation of their network. Perhaps it was meant as insurance, or as a record for future generations, or simply as an act of defiance. We existed, we resisted, we mattered. Dr. Washington found connections to other safe houses across Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina. Each location had its own operators, often women working under the cover of ordinary professions. Teachers, churchwomen, laundresses, cooks, people whose work made them invisible to white authorities, but visible and accessible to black communities in need. The network had code names for different routes and destinations. The River Road led to Savannah and the coast. The mountain path went north toward Tennessee. The Western Trail headed toward Birmingham. Each route had multiple safe houses, backup locations, and trusted guides. What made Clara, Ruth, and Esther's work particularly remarkable was their longevity. Most safe house operators worked for a year or two before the danger became too great or circumstances forced them to stop. But these 3 women operated from at least 1895 to 1903, 8 years of continuous, dangerous work. They must have been extraordinarily careful, Dr. Hayes observed. One mistake, one person talking to the wrong authority, and they would have faced prison violence or worse. Yet they kept going, year after year. James Williams, who had become an integral part of the research, shared more family stories. My grandmother said Clara died in 1904, Ruth in 1911, and Esther lived until 1923, but she said they'd lived full lives, that they'd done what they set out to do. I never understood what she meant. Now I do. Word of the discovery spread through Atlanta's black community, and within weeks, people began reaching out to the History Center. They were descendants of the names carved in the cellar wall, families who had heard whispered stories about ancestors who'd disappeared for a time or who'd started fresh in a new city. 73-year-old Thomas Crawford arrived with a faded letter written by his great-grandfather in 1900. "My grandmother kept this hidden for decades," he explained. "It mentions the women with gentle hands who showed us the way. I always thought it was metaphorical." Oh, Schntus. The letter described a harrowing escape from a rural work camp where Thomas's great-grandfather had been imprisoned on false charges. 3 women, never named, had provided food, clothing, and guidance to Savannah, where he'd boarded a ship north. "He rebuilt his life in Philadelphia," Thomas continued, emotion thick in his voice. "Met my great-grandmother there, raised a family, became a carpenter. But he never forgot the women who saved him. He told my grandmother, 'Their hands knew the way when mine were bound.'" Dr. Hayes recorded Thomas's testimony, adding it to a growing collection of stories. Each testimony revealed another dimension of Clara, Ruth, and Esther's work. Not just the logistics, but the human impact, the lives transformed, the futures made possible. 81-year-old Gloria Henderson shared photographs of her grandmother who'd escaped Atlanta in 1898 as a teenager, pregnant, and fleeing an employer who'd assaulted her. She never said how she got to Baltimore, just that 3 women helped her when no one else would. She said one of them held her hand through the whole night while she cried, told her she was going to survive, that she deserved a better life. The testimonies painted a picture of Clara, Ruth, and Esther as more than operatives. They were counselors, protectors, mothers to those who had none. They didn't just move people along routes. They provided emotional support, medical care, practical advice, and hope. As the research neared completion, Dr. Hayes prepared to publish their findings, but she encountered unexpected resistance from some academic quarters. Several historians questioned whether the hand signals were truly Underground Railroad codes or simply coincidental poses. Others argued that evidence was circumstantial, that a journal and carved names weren't definitive proof. Dr. Washington grew frustrated with the skepticism. If these were white women, their bravery would be celebrated without question. But because they're black women who operated outside official channels, suddenly we need impossible standards of proof. Marcus discovered part of the resistance came from discomfort with the timeline. Some historians built careers arguing the Underground Railroad ended with the Civil War, he explained. Accepting that it continued means acknowledging that emancipation didn't end the oppression, that the struggle continued in ways we haven't fully recognized. Dr. Hayes remained undeterred. She organized a symposium at the History Center, inviting descendants, scholars, and community members. James Williams stood before a packed auditorium, holding the photograph of his great-great-grandmother and her daughters. "These women risked everything," he said, his voice steady. "Not for glory or recognition, but because it was right. The proof isn't just in documents, it's in the descendants who are alive today because Clara, Ruth, and Esther refused to stay silent and safe." The symposium became a turning point. National media picked up the story, and the combination of the photograph, the journal, the carved cellar, and the testimonies from descendants created a compelling narrative that was impossible to dismiss. The Atlanta History Center organized an exhibition titled Hands of Deliverance, the Secret Network of the Post-Emancipation South. The centerpiece was the photograph of Clara, Ruth, and Esther, displayed alongside detailed explanations of the hand signals, excerpts from Clara's journal, and photographs of the names carved in the cellar. But the most powerful element was the wall of descendants. Researchers had identified over 300 living descendants of people helped by the network, children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren of those who'd passed through the Potter's House. Their photographs lined an entire gallery wall, each person holding a sign with their ancestor's name and the year they'd been helped. The exhibition drew thousands of visitors in its first month. Teachers brought entire classes. Families discovered connections they'd never known. The photograph became an icon, not just of resistance, but of the power of ordinary people doing extraordinary things. James Williams donated Clara's journal and the embroidered cloth to the History Center's permanent collection. "They belong to everyone now," he said. "The story isn't just about my family, it's about all of us." Preservation efforts continued at the Potter's House site. The city designated it a historic landmark, and fundraising began for a restoration project that would transform it into an educational center. The cellar would be preserved exactly as found, names intact, a sacred space honoring those who'd been saved and those who'd saved them. Dr. Washington published a comprehensive book documenting the network, expanding the research to identify similar operations across the South. The book became essential reading in African American history courses nationwide, challenging long-held assumptions about the timeline and nature of resistance in the post-Civil War era. On a warm September afternoon in 2021, exactly 2 years after Marcus first noticed the unusual hand positions, a ceremony was held at the restored Potter's House. Descendants of Clara, Ruth, and Esther gathered alongside descendants of those they'd helped, over 200 people spanning 5 generations. A bronze plaque was unveiled near the entrance, bearing the photograph and an inscription. In this house, Clara, Ruth, and Esther Potter guided more than 200 souls to safety between 1895 and 1903. Their hands spoke when words were dangerous. Their courage saved lives when silence would have been easier. May we remember that freedom requires constant vigilance and that ordinary people can change the course of history. James Williams stood with his children and grandchildren, looking at the photograph displayed prominently inside the restored house. My great-great-grandmother and her daughters lived in a time that tried to erase them, he said. But they left clues. They left signs. They trusted that someday someone would see what they'd hidden in plain sight and tell their story. Marcus, now completing his doctorate with a focus on coded resistance in the post-Reconstruction South, reflected on the moment that had changed his career and life. That Tuesday morning, when I saw the photograph, I almost didn't look closely. I almost moved on to the next item. It makes you wonder how many other stories are waiting in archives, in attics, in forgotten boxes, waiting for someone to ask the right questions. Dr. Hayes gave the final remarks, her voice carrying across the assembled crowd. This photograph teaches us that our ancestors were brilliant, strategic, and brave. They found ways to resist that we're only beginning to understand. They encoded their resistance in gestures and symbols and everyday objects that authorities overlooked, and they trusted that future generations would be smart enough, determined enough to decode their messages. She held up a reproduction of the photograph.